Professor Vegetti, in historical and political terms, what was the situation like in Athens at the time of Plato?
Between the end of the 5th century and the first half of the 4th century BC, Plato lived through the crisis phase of the polis, and of the Athenian polis in particular. As far as Plato's thinking was concerned, this crisis hit home especially on one point. It revealed the basic failure of the project which had led to the birth of the polis, the endeavor to which the polis was dedicated, and that was to instill a homogeneity in the corpus of citizens which would resolve all social conflicts within this corpus, and conceivably manifest them only externally in the form of warfare. This project for the unification, the recomposition of the social corpus, making it possible to avoid conflicts and disputes, had failed. The Peloponnesian War had reawakened in Athens the social conflict between oligarchs and democrats, between the aristocracy and the demos, basically speaking between rich and poor, which the city had sought to overcome through its political forms. In fact, Plato began the Republic by saying that the city before him was no longer one, but two cities in conflict within the same walls, the city of the rich on one side and that of the poor on the other. If this was the state of affairs, it meant that the city had failed in its task. When Plato criticized the polis and criticized the history of Athenian policy, he really wasn't criticizing its failure in history. According to Plato, the city still had to be constructed. Since historical events such as the Peloponnesian War, the oligarchic coup d'etat of 404, masterminded by a close relative of Plato's named Critias, and the restoration of democracy, which had led to the death sentence imposed upon Socrates, as someone mixed up, among other things, with aristocratic circles, had shown that the city had not accomplished its own project. In Plato's mind, this crisis had to be the starting point, not for declaring the idea of city a failure, but for really constructing the city with respect to a failure which had come to light during these dramatic years. Plato was therefore a man who intended to reconstruct the polis as originally planned after a difficult crisis. But he could not come up with a political form other than the polis. The polis was still to be constructed. It was not over, it had never been achieved. And this was the point of departure for Plato's ethical political efforts towards the reconstruction or refounding of the polis.
Now, this great monument of philosophy, which are Plato's dialogues, can we say they were written, as it were, under the influence of political concern? In other words, can we say, as some people sustain, that the philosophical problem and the political problem coincide in Plato?
In a certain sense, yes. Plato, in his own right, was also a man of the loftiest aristocratic lineage, and therefore, as he states in Letter 7, for family reasons, let's say for natural reasons, he was destined to political leadership tasks. And as he himself tells us, his philosophical reflection began around the time of the oligarchic coup d'etat, the death of Critias, and then the trial of Socrates. Therefore, Plato certainly received a stimulus to his thinking from a political situation, and all the more so since his philosophy was principally an ethical philosophy, in the sense of a philosophy geared to improve the moral quality of people, to make men just. In the general context surrounding Plato's thinking, it was not possible for there to be just men except within a just city, since helping men to become just meant educating them, and the subject of education could only be a collective subject, a social subject, and hence the city. Naturally enough, there is no just city if its citizens are not just, but vice versa, its citizens cannot become just if the city as a whole does not take upon itself the responsibility of an educational endeavor, a project of transformation. For Plato, therefore, morals and politics were very closely entwined. It was necessary to change the city in order to change men, and naturally also change men in order to change the city. This is a relationship which ensures that the basic motivation of Plato's philosophy is closely involved with a political objective. However, I would say this is only one part of the truth, and not the entire truth. Because Plato also considered that the only way to refound the polis, to construct a just polis and just citizens, was a way passing through knowledge, and therefore passing through a recovery of the scientific disciplines and of that supreme synthesis of scientific knowledge, that apex of knowledge, which is philosophy. Without philosophy, you cannot even reform the city. So, from this point of view, philosophy, and all the disciplines culminating in philosophy, which, in Plato's mind, went from mathematics to astronomy, were a preliminary condition for any possible refounding of the city. According to Plato, the city had fallen into crisis due to a lack of knowledge on the part of those who wielded power. Therefore, in order to reconstruct a just power, it was necessary for those who held power to possess knowledge, scientific and primarily philosophical knowledge. From this viewpoint, it was true that philosophy also had its own independence and fundamental role with respect to politics. In a certain sense, the former was a condition for the latter, just as in another sense it was a consequence, because true philosophical knowledge could begin to unfold anew only in the just city, morally and politically reconstructed.
Therefore, the separation between politics on one hand and culture on the other, which nowadays seems rather obvious to us, was pretty inconceivable for Plato.
Yes, for Plato it was exactly this separation which had led to the crisis of the city. At the beginning of the first book of the Republic, there is a debate of extraordinary importance, and the main speaker is a sophist named Thrasymachus, who sustains a very strong position. According to Thrasymachus, justice is nothing other than the interest of those who hold power. And he argues his thesis in a very linear way. Whoever is in power has the strength to impose laws, and the laws sanction what is just and what is unjust. Therefore, since those in power issue laws in their own interest for the conservation of their own power, it is evident that justice is a function of power, and not vice versa. In a certain sense, all the rest of the Republic was written by Plato in response to Thrasymachus's position, to try and substitute for the idea of a power of oppression and exploitation, like that of Thrasymachus, the idea of a service-oriented power, a power exercised in the interests of the subjects and not in order to exploit them. According to Plato, however, this new power could not be derived from wealth, because it was clear that if power was wedded to wealth, it would be at the service of wealth, and therefore, once again, a power of vested interest and exploitation. Nor could it be derived from the will of the majority, because the will of the majority, as such, was a will without the instruments needed to understand what was the real interest of the majority. The majority expresses desires, vague, attractive projects, which are often related to short-term desires, without any clear awareness of what is truly useful for the city as a whole. Therefore, power was to be abandoned neither to the rich nor to the masses. From this viewpoint, power could only be exercised by those possessing the knowledge necessary to grasp the general interests, and therefore to offer a service to the community as a whole, and not to one or another part of the community, even if this part was the majority part. Basically speaking, I'd say that here we have a core concept in the history of Plato's political thinking. The universal interest is not necessarily represented by the majority of the community. In fact, ordinarily it's not represented at all. The universal interest can be understood and administered only when power is held by a small part, which nonetheless possesses those intellectual instruments of knowledge, making it possible to grasp what really are the general interests. I'd say that this dialectic between the part and the whole was the soul of Plato's political project, which set him against both the oligarchic trends, the power of the rich classes to which he himself belonged, and against the democratic inclinations understood as the mere recording of the majority's wishes, which were not necessarily the community's true interests.
This coincidence between the philosopher and the political man has induced some people, Popper for example, to consider Plato as the one who inaugurated all the tyrannical theories of power. Now, do you agree with this thesis, that there might be something like this behind Plato's theory?
From
the viewpoint of the liberal democratic tradition to which Popper belongs, the criticism is certainly a motivated one. Plato thought that the mere recording, as I said, of the majority's opinion had no meaning. He also felt that what counted was people's just behavior, and not whether they were free or not. Plato quite clearly retained that it was much better to do the right things out of an obligation to do them, under constrictions to do them, than to be free to do the wrong things. Therefore, what was important for Plato was not individual liberty as a value in itself, but the fact that the community as a whole and individuals acted in a morally and ethically correct way. It's therefore clear that the scale of liberal and democratic values was not a priority for Plato. What was a priority, on the other hand, was that the ethical values, the values of justice, which each single person had to accept as a whole, had to be just. There again, what did it mean to Plato to be just? It meant to respect the hierarchy of power in the correct way. It meant that everyone should accept that the part able to command, insofar as endowed with the intellectual means, actually commands, and that the other parts of society, identified by Plato in two fundamental parts fulfilling the military function and the productive function, that the other two parts of society, each within its own ambit, be obedient to this power, which was the only legitimate power, because it was founded, I repeat, on knowledge. Justice, therefore, meant to accept one's own social role, and not aim to exercise a role other than the one for which a person was qualified. And it was the same thing for the human soul, that is, for each and every individual. According to Plato, our soul is divided into three parts: a rational part, corresponding to philosophers on the social level, a courageous and emotive part, corresponding to the military function, and a third, inferior part, linked to desires and to corporeity, which corresponds to the productive function. Hence, the justice of the soul is attained for Plato when all the parts of the soul, in unison, like a symphony, as he said, accept the power of reason over the two other parts, and those two parts agree to carry out their respective functions in an orderly way without trying to overwhelm the power of reason. There is injustice when anger, courageous wrath, rules in the soul, or when what reigns is the world of desires bound to the flesh, just as there is injustice in the city when power is held by the non-philosophical parts of the corpus of the citizens. It is therefore easily understandable how, from a liberal democratic point of view, Plato comes across as a totalitarian thinker, in the sense of entrusting all power to one part and subjecting the citizens to the general interests of the entire city. In another excerpt, for example, Plato sustained the unacceptability of the medicine of his time, a medicine which was advancing, was developing, and, in his opinion, was refining diseases by making each sick person a chronic patient, because medicine was engrossed in treating his illness in every detail instead of restoring, as quickly as possible, the individual capacity to contribute to the general interests, to political work, to political activity, to productive work. If someone, Plato said, was no longer able to give his personal contribution to the social interests, it was useless to treat him, and better for him to die, since he was futile for the city and for himself. There is quite clearly, therefore, a prevalence of the communal, collective, as opposed to the individual point of view, to such an extent that people have spoken of Platonic communism. Platonic communism resides in the separation Plato believed necessary, as I said, between power and wealth. Those who hold power must not possess any patrimony, must neither possess assets nor be linked to a family, because that would mean they would once again exercise power according to their own private interests, whether those be patrimonial or family in nature. The negation of private wealth, of private property, and of the family only applied for Plato to the leadership class, and not for the classes under them. Hence, if a communism can be attributed to Plato, it was a very partial communism, limited to the leaders, and not to society as a whole.
We know Plato left Athens more than once to cross the Mediterranean or the way to Syracuse, in an effort to influence political experiments. Now, with respect to what you said before about the criticism of formal democracy, about the principle of majority, is this to be connected with these journeys? In other words, in order to conduct his experiment of politeia, republic, new state, did Plato prefer leaving democratic Athens and try his hand at educating a tyrant?
Plato actually thought there were two ways to reform the city. The first way was for philosophers to assume power, and although this was the most desirable way, it was also the longest and the most difficult, because it entailed an effort in collective education to make it possible. And therefore, as he says explicitly in the Republic, he thought there could be a short cut. And this was to take someone who already held power and turn him into a philosopher, convert a tyrant into a philosopher. This explains Plato's repeated attempts to re-educate the tyrants of Syracuse to philosophy. Certainly, to convert a single person is a much faster and more effective way than to convince an entire city, or the democratic majority of an entire city. Naturally enough, Plato was bitterly disappointed over his efforts in Syracuse, because he realized he was having no success in converting the tyrants, and was actually being used in an instrumental way by those tyrants. Nonetheless, this possibility remained in Plato's thinking, and he left it in writing, both in the Republic and in Letter 7. Where one person holds absolute power, it would suffice to convert that one person in order to begin the refounding of the city, to make it a collective educational endeavor, and therefore to improve the citizens, to have better men, I repeat, in a better city.
You mentioned Letter 7, where Plato retraces the main stages of his political experience. The 7th letter begins with reflections on his dear friend Socrates, and with a critical consideration. It would almost seem that Socrates had made some mistakes, or else, for him, this experience led him to reflections which helped him to mature. Could you explain this passage?
Plato most likely attributed an act of gullibility to Socrates, who had believed the polis to be what he had thought it was. In other words, he had believed that the polis had become unified, homogeneous, and required nothing more than a direct educational effort. In brief, Socrates did not dwell on the essence of power. Socrates thought that a single citizen within the city could, with patience and tenacity, re-educate his fellow citizens. He didn't think the problem of power was the core issue, and that if the power structures are not changed, the individual commitment of a single person, a single philosopher, is destined to the same type of tragic outcome suffered by Socrates himself. The crucial turning point of Plato's thought, as presented in the Republic, was precisely in the thesis that it was not possible to change the city unless the power structure was changed, and, particularly, if philosophers did not assume power.
Che non si può modificare la città se non si modifica la sua struttura di potere e in particolare se i filosofi.
Socrates had most likely made the mistake of not tackling this problem, and perhaps of not having seen that not only a critical attitude towards the forms of knowledge in the city was required. Socrates criticized politicians, artisans, poets, but also the positive presentation of a positive knowledge. Not only a form of critical confutation, but knowledge in a form of abstraction of theories, scientific, dialectic, logical, philosophical theories, such as the ones Plato sought to propose in his philosophical endeavors.
You referred earlier to the position of Thrasymachus in the first book of the Republic, and we can see a sort of, let's say, scorn in Plato for characters such as Thrasymachus. At the same time, however, Plato frequently referred to the sophists of a noble sophism when speaking about Protagoras and Gorgias. Could you briefly tell us something about this intense interplay between Plato and the sophists, not only Thrasymachus but also Gorgias and Protagoras on the political level?
The answer to this question calls for a preliminary observation. In a certain sense, the sophists, or at least the sophists we know about, are Plato's so-called inventions. They are characters in Plato's dialogues. If Plato had not spoken about them, we would know nothing about men like Thrasymachus, or like Polos and Callicles, who appear in the Gorgias. But even the great sophists, like Gorgias and Protagoras, had long been dead when Plato wrote his dialogues. It was what we could call almost a theatrical representation of a generation of thinkers. And at this point, Plato presented on his philosophical stage a comparative display of two generations of sophists. The generation of the elders, like Protagoras and Gorgias, who, in his opinion, were honestly involved in the endeavor to construct the democratic polis, even though, as Plato saw it, with unsatisfactory intellectual means and with an inadequate ethical outlook. This generation, however, was succeeded by another one, which, according to Plato, did not even possess this seriousness and honest concern for the polis, but, how can I put it, lived in the shadows of the crisis of the polis, exploiting it to immediate personal advantage. These were therefore cynical men, who believed in no collective values and were actually at the service of the crisis and not at the service of the effort to resolve the crisis, because in this crisis they found their share of wealth, renown and power. Plato assailed this generation, but at the very time he depicted it, he needed interlocutors who were at his intellectual level. And therefore the figure of Thrasymachus was evoked in the Republic, propounding ideas which the real Thrasymachus, the historical Thrasymachus, had never sustained. Theses much stronger than ones Thrasymachus himself could ever have come up with, because Plato needed such a starting point in order to develop his own reply. In a certain sense, therefore, while criticizing the sophists, he endowed them with great intellectual prowess.
Speaking about the Republic earlier, we said it is a treatise on education. but we know that the Republic is also a treatise on the issue of the good. It is, let's say, an ontological treatise. Now, there are many interpretations of the substance of the Republic. Are these interpretations piled one upon another, or can we say that all these things coexist in Plato's work?
Nella Repubblica Platone ha questa straordinaria ambizione di unificazione.
In the Republic, Plato embodied this extraordinary unification ambition.
Una gerarchia delle scienze.
He thought it was possible to imagine a hierarchy of the sciences, including the most abstract sciences like mathematics, astronomy, and geometry, and the objects of the sciences, and therefore a hierarchy of the ideas which constitute the world of being. A hierarchy which would have at its apex an ethical value which was the good. In other words, the good would be the keystone for the entire edifice of science and being, which gave a moral and political sense to all the rest. Insofar as subordinate to the good and participating in the good, each idea had a value, even if it was a mathematical idea, like, let's say, a square or a diagonal. And insofar as subordinate to the good, each science had a value. The mathematical sciences also had to have an ethical, political value. And lastly, these relationships of value were to be included in a specific knowledge which was philosophical dialectic. Therefore, philosophical dialectic was that form of knowledge which could grasp the value structure which was at the apex of the pyramid of being and knowledge, and transmit from this apex to all the branches of knowledge. This extremely difficult and complicated line of reasoning was also a project of extraordinary ambition, in the sense of having every expression of reality and every branch of knowledge depend upon a value. For Plato, however, this was necessary so that the various sectors of knowledge and the various sectors of being would not, we could say, each proceed on their own account, without being able to be unified in what he called a synoptic vision, which was the vision of the philosophy expected to be able to restore unity and project it upon a moral and political background. Aristotle was completely to dismantle this attempt at synthesis. He was to say that the scope of the mathematical sciences was not the good, not the ethical, political value, but the truth in their own field, and therefore each science was independent in respect to the others, and there was no common point of reference or a common origin in this idea of the good, which for Plato represented what had to hold together being and, as a consequence, the edifice of science as well. However, it was an extremely difficult project, which was also discussed by Plato in sketchy terms, by metaphors in Book 6 and Book 7 of the Republic, and which naturally lends itself to quite different interpretations. It is possible to stress the theological facet by making the good a sort of divine figure, as was to transpire later in the Neoplatonic tradition. In the good, we can also focus in a special way on the ontological aspect, on the principle of being, and less so on the principle of value. However, this conflicts with the fact that Plato called this supreme idea the good, that is, he used a term of value. The interpretations are quite different, and Plato himself did not resolve the problem in a systematic way. Nonetheless, I firmly believe that the sense expressed postulates a possibility for the unification of the world in the sense of ethical, political value. The metaphor used by Plato to explain this supremacy of the good was the metaphor of the sun. Just as the sun is behind the birth of things, the birth of the plants, the life of the animals, and the visibility of things, The sun makes things visible and makes the eye able to see them. In the same way, the being of things and their knowability derive from the good. Being and knowability are principles of meaning. They are what give things a meaning. It was important for Plato that there be a regard which viewed the unity of the world and the global sense of the world, the purpose of the world, the destination of the world. The danger was to permit the world to break up into fragments bereft of meaning. Basically speaking, this was Plato's project and struggle in the Republic, and also in many other dialogues. Plato naturally returned to this problem from many different viewpoints. In the Timaeus, he had the tendency to divinitize the function of the good, attaching to it a figure like that of the demiurgos. In other dialogues, the good comes across more as the first being, but I would say that the project of synthesis was taken almost to its extreme limits in the Republic.
I'm just wondering if this difficulty in understanding Plato's ideas on politics and his philosophy in general might not also be due to the fact, for example, that science is neutral, and there is no relationship between what is true or what is beautiful or what is good, etc. Does this also give rise to our difficulty in understanding the Platonic synthesis?
Certainly. From this point of view, we are the offspring of Aristotle, in the sense that we are accustomed to thinking that the functions of truth and the functions of justice, or the aesthetical functions, are separate and belong to different realms in the mental consideration of reality. And Aristotle was the one who educated us to think in this way, and who presided over this long tradition that has come down to us. Aristotle used to say that Plato wrote poetry. He said it in an ironic way, in the sense that Plato had a tendency to put together things that could not stand together, in his excessive ambition to govern the wholeness of reality and knowledge in an integrated manner, in one extreme move. Mathematics, for Aristotle, had no ethical function, no aesthetic aspect, etc. We certainly find it difficult to understand the striving for unity deployed by Plato, because, in a certain sense, Plato is archaic compared to Aristotle. Aristotle was more modern in his idea that there were independent and separate regions of being and of science. I feel that after Plato, the only person who accomplished such a major effort of unification was perhaps Hegel. But aside from that, there are no possible comparisons.
In the Republic, Plato drew up a classification of the unjust forms of real cities set against the model of the ideal city. What were the types of unjust cities and how were they analyzed by Plato?
Plato described the story of a decadent regression. I would just note in passing a rather interesting fact. Unlike we, who have an historical mentality, Plato did not place the ideal city as the point of arrival, as the end of a process to be followed. Instead, he positioned it as the point of departure. That is to say, Plato thought the ideal city had existed in some remote time. He thought it had to have existed if it had to return into existence. Therefore, we live in an age of decadent regression from the achievement of the ideal city. And only this enables us to think we will return to that level, to that perfect form. This is a rather unique and interesting way of thinking, because it is far removed from our customary perspective, which is an historical one. So, Plato thought that the ideal city had existed at some remote point in time, and that the rest of history was a tale of decadence. The forms of decadence also enabled Plato to construct a typology of the historical cities, of the types of constructions or regimes existent in history, each of them defective in their own way. The first level of decadence consisted of what Plato called the timocratic city, where the people fought out of a desire for power, where what prevailed in the motivation behind human behavior was the desire for glory and power. For Plato, this corresponded to what was still a positive phase, recognizable in the best features of Sparta. The next phase, however, was oligarchy, and this set in when men no longer fought for power, but for wealth, in order to make power a way to attain riches. They no longer wanted honor, they just wanted to be rich. And Plato considered this a form of decadence experienced by the historical Sparta. Hence, Sparta was living in a world in a time of oligarchy. The next phase was that of democracy, when the dispute over wealth breaks up into this regime which Plato called multi-hued, where all desires enjoyed free rein, where power or riches were not pursued only by a few people, but where each person pursued the fulfillment of any personal desire. Plato looked upon this regime as pleasant and agreeable, as he said, but certainly anarchic, and bereft of any rules, any norms, any value which could be considered universal. According to Plato, democracy inevitably led to the most degenerate phase possible for forms of politics, and that was tyranny. Plurality, the anarchy of democracy, inevitably leads to the reaction whereby one man assumes all the power and uses it in order to fulfill his own private desires. In Plato's mind, a tyrant is a madman, a slave to his erotic desires, a slave to his desires for wealth, a slave to the fulfillment of these personal desires. Therefore, the tyrant, tyranny, was the most degenerate form of constitution possible. This tyranny was what Plato, for example, experienced first-hand in Sicily, and from which he tried to go against the current, because, if tyranny was the most degenerate form, it was feasible to think that the circle could be closed and everything begin anew from there. And this is exactly what Plato tried to do in his efforts to convert the tyrant of Syracuse, in order to bring him to philosophy. In this way, Plato constructed a history of the decadence of political forms, a history of the decadence of the human city, and at the same time he outlined a way which should serve as the point of departure for the ascent.
Still on the Republic, in it we find many myths, and there are various theses on why Plato used these myths, whether for reasons of exposition or due to a theoretical difficulty in exposing what he thought in exact terms. The fact is that the myth of the cave is one of the most famous myths of our philosophical culture. Could you describe it in brief, touching on the main contents and its meaning?
What we have here is an immense allegorical presentation. There is this cave with prisoners chained, so they can only look towards the rear of the cave. Passing back and forth behind them are figurines, sorts of puppets, illuminated by a fire, also behind the prisoners. These figurines cast their shadows on the back wall of the cave. The prisoners have never seen anything except for these shadows, and they therefore believe that these shadows are the world, are reality. They even build up a science on these shadows and try to predict what will be the order of precedence as the shadows pass along. They then bestow great honors on the person who makes the best guess on which figurine will pass ahead of all the others. It is substantially an empirical science. Now, Plato sustained that the condition of men was like that of someone who lives believing that what exists are only shadows. The shadows are therefore empirical, daily reality, what happens before our senses. One of these men, says Plato, escapes, leaves the cave, and realizes that the true light is not the light of the fire, but that of the sun, that the true figures are not the puppets' shadows, but animals, plants, mountains, etc. In order to interpret the allegory, you have a vision of the world of ideas, of the true realities governed by the good which is naturally in the place of the sun. This vision makes the escaped prisoner understand the error in which his companions live.
Governato dal bene che sta naturalmente al posto del sole. Questa visione fa comprendere al prigioniero fuggito.
He therefore goes back into the cave and strives to explain to them that it's not true that the only existing things are the shadows, and not even what happens behind their backs. That outside there is a truer and more beautiful world. However, these prisoners, who have always lived in this condition, do not believe this. They think he's crazy, and they try to catch him and kill him. In all of this, Plato naturally depicted part of what had happened to Socrates, and in a certain sense also his own malaise, and that of the philosopher in general, who tries to represent levels of reality, levels of truth, levels of beauty, which are beyond common and daily experiences, the shadows moving across the rear wall of the cave, and therefore generate irritation, indignation, and annoyance in those who have never looked outside the cave. There is a danger in being a philosopher, in leaving the cave, in seeing other things, the danger of their being rejected by the community. Yet there is also a duty. Plato thought the philosopher had to go back into the cave, even if that was most unpleasant. He had to return because his was the duty to attempt a moral and cognitive re-education of his former fellow prisoners.
Somewhat in the same regard, we know Hegel used an aphorism to say philosophy is present time grasped in thought. Can we say that there was a duty to understand one's own time for Plato?
Yes, but it cannot be compared to Hegel's thinking, because in Plato there was always a here and there, an up and a down. Philosophy was not so much the fact of thinking one's own time, as it was that of pondering the otherness of one's time, what resided higher up, what escaped from daily experience. While for Hegel it was possible to think that a strict conceptualization of an existing fact was philosophy, philosophy for Plato was always something which was further on, which went beyond the existent fact for daily experience. There was a whole sky full of ideas that had to be looked upon. For Plato, therefore, philosophy was always an act of going beyond, transcending, moving upwards, and this has little to do with Hegel.
Di spostarsi verso l'alto, e questo è veramente poco.
Then there is naturally the problem of the return, the duty of philosophy to shed light on the lowly here and now from what comes from above, from the luminous source, from outside time, from the sphere of the intemporal. But for Plato there was always a problem of the relationship between what was not in time and what was in time, while everything was in time for Hegel. And this is the difference between an historicist like Hegel and a great idealist like Plato.
In the Republic, we also have a description, above and beyond the different social classes, a description of the role and function of women in the Republic, in the ideal city, etc. Could you tell us about this function?
Nel libro Quinto della Repubblica Platone fa delle affermazioni che sono
Yes, Book 5 of the Republic contains statements by Plato which are absolutely extraordinary, practically unique in the entire history of ancient thought. Plato said there was no reason in principle why women should be inferior to men, or excluded from the level of power specific to men. This went against the social structure of the Greek city, back then during the time of Plato, and for all later times, when women were strictly excluded from participation in political activities and relentlessly confined within the ambit of home and family. However, to the extent that he wanted to do away with the family as an instrument for the privatization of affective and patrimonial interests, Plato quite naturally raised the issue of a liberation of women from family bonds and an integration of women as citizens like others in the management of power. Just like everyone else, women will be good or bad according to whether they receive a good or bad education. Plato justified the inferiority of women in his time because they received an education far worse than that of men, and were therefore far worse themselves. But, and here we come to Plato's optimism based on education, if women were to receive an education equal to that of men, there would be no reason why they should not be the equals of men. Certainly, there still remained the obvious physical differences in terms of strength and all that, but in principle, no intellectual differences. In this regard, people have talked about Plato's feminism, but feminists have criticized his position. The feminist side points out that Plato did not accept the parity of women in their specificity, in their being women, and that when he sustained the parity of women, he laid down the condition that women became equals to men through a good education. In other words, the liberation and the equality of women came about through uniformity on all levels between men and women, and therefore women had in fact to become like men, and in that case they had all the rights. This was certainly a subtle issue, and the liberation of women from the family bond was necessary to Plato because, as I said, he feared the pernicious influence of the family in terms of the enhancement of private interests, and hence the downfall of the collective interest. If the family exists, women perform a negative function in it, because they give the children a bad education and all that. By destroying the family and dissolving these bonds, women can, I repeat, become like men. This can be assessed in one way or another, but it was certainly a fundamentally important statement of position, because except for an author like Plutarch, who was also Platonic, no one else in antiquity ever propounded such a radical thesis on a possible parity between men and women.
Professor, by way of conclusion and linking up with this last answer, can we speak about Plato being relevant today?
È molto difficile dare una risposta univoca.
It's difficult to give an absolute answer. Regarding certain facets, as I was saying, Plato is a thinker with many archaic features. He thought in terms of a unity of knowledge, of being, which is obviously difficult to share today. He thought in terms of a marked integration of the social corpus, which, as I said, is opposed by the entire tradition of liberal and democratic thinking. Almost a tribal integration of the civil corpus, and therefore a clear domination of the collective sphere over the individual one. From this angle, it is difficult to argue the present-day relevance of a Plato who breaks reality into two levels, the superior level of ideas and the inferior level of the empirical world, a level endowed with a metaphysical and almost theological dignity, as opposed to the level of the empirical world, the degraded and demoted historical world. All this certainly makes Plato a thinker who, I repeat, can be accused of being archaic. In other ways, however, for things like the ability to pursue a project, the idea that philosophy must also and always be an ethical and political project, the idea that the world can be transformed through education, the idea that what is needed is an effort of knowledge able to transform social and political reality as well. For these things, Platonism is probably still relevant, and in a certain sense, we could say we still need Plato.